In Episode 7, titled Scoping the Engagement, we're going to treat scope as the practical control that prevents costly mistakes and protects everyone involved, including the client, the tester, and any third parties touched by the work. Pen Test Plus questions frequently reward the candidate who reads scope details with the same seriousness as technical evidence, because scope is what determines whether an action is professional or unacceptable. Clear scope prevents you from wandering into forbidden systems, causing unapproved disruption, or collecting data you were never meant to handle. It also protects the client by keeping the engagement aligned to objectives and by reducing operational surprises that create distrust. By the end of this episode, you should be able to look at any scenario prompt, identify what is in and out, and choose actions that stay within the agreed rails. Scope contains a handful of core elements, and you want to be able to name them quickly because they act like filters for every decision. Targets define what systems, networks, applications, or accounts are authorized for testing, and they can be written broadly or narrowly depending on the engagement. Objectives define what you are trying to prove, such as validating exposure, identifying weaknesses, or demonstrating meaningful impact under constraints. Exclusions define what must not be touched, even if it is adjacent, similar, or technically reachable from an in-scope target. Success criteria define what done looks like, which might be a set of findings, proof of impact, evidence artifacts, or a coverage expectation that the client cares about. When you can see these elements clearly, you stop improvising and start operating with the structure the exam expects.
Interpreting target lists is a skill by itself, because targets can be expressed as ranges, domains, applications, and accounts, and each format carries implications.
A range implies a boundary and address space, which can still include many systems you did not individually name, but that are included by virtue of the defined range. Domains and applications imply functional scope, where the target is an app or a service rather than a single host, and your actions should be aligned to that service's surface area. Accounts imply identity scope, meaning the engagement may allow testing of authentication flows, access pathways, or role boundaries, but only within permitted identities and policies. The exam often mixes these, and the point is to recognize what each format authorizes, not to assume that in the same environment means in scope. When a prompt gives a target list, treat it as a contract boundary and interpret it conservatively rather than expansively.
Exclusions are where many exam traps live because they highlight the difference between technical reach and authorized reach. Nearby systems can be forbidden even if they share the same network, use the same identity platform, or sit behind the same load balancer, and the exam expects you to respect that. Exclusions can exist for safety, business sensitivity, third-party ownership, or operational stability, and none of those reasons disappear just because a tester believes the excluded system is important. A frequent trap is an answer choice that suggests testing an excluded system to complete the picture or to confirm lateral movement, when the prompt has clearly drawn that line. The correct approach is to treat exclusions as hard boundaries, and to look for answers that either avoid the system or escalate for clarification rather than crossing it. When you internalize this, you start answering like a professional who values trust as much as technical progress.
Constraints are the environmental rules that shape how and when testing can occur, and they can change the best action even when the technical goal stays the same.
Time windows restrict when active testing is allowed, which can affect the order you choose actions and the type of validation you attempt.
Sensitive systems constraints may prohibit disruptive methods, require extra notification, or demand conservative approaches that reduce operational risk. Change freezes create a heightened need for caution because environments are often tightly controlled during those periods, and unplanned effects can be difficult to interpret or remediate.
Pen Test Plus prompts may mention these constraints with a short phrase, but that short phrase is often the deciding factor between two otherwise plausible answers. When you see constraints, treat them as the rules of motion within the scope, and allow them to veto answer choices that would violate the environment's stability expectations.
When details are missing or ambiguous, the correct move is not to guess aggressively. It is to clarify assumptions in a professional way. The exam often describes scenarios where you discover something unexpected or where a target description is vague, and it tests whether you treat ambiguity as a signal to pause rather than a license to expand. Clarifying assumptions means identifying what you do not know that affects legality, safety, or scope, and then using the established communication path to confirm. This also includes recognizing when an assumption would change the risk of an action, such as assuming a system belongs to the client when it may be third-party, or assuming a host is in scope because it is reachable from an in-scope subnet. When you practice this mindset, you become less vulnerable to trap answers that reward speed over discipline. A professional tester moves quickly, but they move quickly within known boundaries, not quickly into unknown ones. Objectives shape actions because they define what the client wants proven, and different objectives demand different behaviors. If the objective is to validate exposure, then your actions should focus on confirming that a weakness exists and that it is relevant, often with minimal disruption and minimal data collection. If the objective is to demonstrate impact, then you may need controlled proof that shows what the weakness enables, but still within authorized limits and with safeguards that protect operations. Some prompts imply the client wants coverage, while others imply they want prioritized proof of real risk, and your best answer should align to that implied goal. Objectives also influence how much depth is appropriate, because proving a point too deeply can create unnecessary harm, while staying too shallow can fail to meet success criteria. On the exam, the best option is often the one that matches the objective's intent rather than the one that is merely technically impressive. Evidence expectations are another part of scope discipline, because what you capture and what you avoid collecting can be the difference between a defensible engagement and an unnecessary exposure. Evidence should be sufficient to support findings, reproduce conclusions, and communicate impact in a credible way, but it should not become bulk collection just in case. Avoid collecting sensitive data beyond what is required to prove the point, because excessive collection increases confidentiality risk and can violate client expectations. The prompt may not list specific evidence types, but it often implies sensitivity through business context, operational constraints, or explicit confidentiality emphasis. This is also where professionalism shows up. You capture what supports the story of risk without turning the engagement into data harvesting. On Pen Test Plus questions, options that show restraint and purpose in evidence collection tend to align with the expected professional standard.
Scope creep is the gradual expansion of work beyond what was agreed, and it can happen through enthusiasm, curiosity, or social pressure. The exam sometimes frames this as an informal request to just check one more thing, or as a suggestion that you should test a related system because it is technically accessible.
Social pressure can come from a stakeholder who wants quick reassurance, or from a technical contact who assumes you are allowed to explore anything you can reach. The correct response is to recognize that being able to and being allowed to are not the same, and to route changes through proper authorization. Scope creep also harms the engagement by diluting focus, increasing operational risk, and creating findings that are difficult to defend if questioned later. When you see answer choices that casually expand testing, treat them skeptically unless the prompt clearly indicates that expansion is authorized and documented.
Now imagine a scenario where a new target appears midstream unexpectedly, because that is a classic scope test wrapped in a technical story. You are working through an authorized target set, and during enumeration, you discover an additional system that looks relevant, perhaps because it is connected, shares an identity boundary, or appears to host data that the client cares about. The temptation is to treat it as automatically included, especially if testing it would be efficient and satisfying. But the scope discipline mindset says that discovery does not equal authorization, and a new target is a boundary event that requires conscious handling. The exam wants you to notice that this is not merely a technical discovery. It is a scope question disguised as a technical discovery. When you place it that way, you will naturally prioritize pausing and confirming rather than charging ahead.
The correct response path in that situation is to pause, confirm authorization, and document the decision, because those three actions preserve safety and defensibility.
Pausing does not mean stopping all progress forever. It means recognizing that continuing on the new target could violate scope, and that the risk of violating scope outweighs the speed benefit. Confirming authorization means using the agreed escalation or communication path to determine whether the new system is included, excluded, or needs a formal scope change.
Documenting the decision matters because later reporting and any dispute resolution rely on a clear record of what was discovered, what was decided, and why. On exam questions, the best choice often includes some combination of these behaviors, even if the options are phrased differently.
When you can see the pause confirm document pattern, you will avoid answers that treat scope boundaries as optional when an opportunity appears. To make scope decisions fast and repeatable under pressure, use a quick checklist that frames the decision around 5 practical anchors: target, method, data, timing, and escalation contacts. Target asks whether the system, app, or account is explicitly included and whether any exclusions apply even if it is adjacent. Method asks whether the action you are considering is permitted under the rules and constraints, especially regarding disruption and safety. Data asks what evidence you might collect and whether that collection aligns with confidentiality expectations and minimum necessary principles. Timing asks whether the current window allows the action and whether a change freeze or sensitive period alters the acceptable approach. Escalation contacts asks who you should notify if uncertainty appears or if you encounter a boundary event, because scope management is a communication discipline as much as a technical one. A useful way to summarize scope decisions is to reduce them to 3 mental buckets: yes, no, and ask. Yes, actions are clearly in scope, permitted by constraints, aligned with objectives, and safe under timing rules, so you can proceed with confidence and document normally. No, actions violate exclusions, exceed permissions, or break safety and timing rules, and the correct move is to avoid them even if they seem efficient or technically interesting. Ask actions sit in ambiguity, where proceeding would require assumptions that could cause legal, ethical, or operational problems, so the correct move is to escalate and confirm. This framing reduces hesitation because it replaces vague uncertainty with a decision category that has an appropriate professional response. On the exam, many tricky questions become easier when you identify the situation as ask rather than forcing yourself to pick a technical action prematurely.
In this episode, the main lesson is that scope is not paperwork. It is the decision framework that keeps testing professional, safe, and defensible.
Scope includes targets, objectives, exclusions, constraints, and success criteria, and you should interpret target definitions conservatively rather than stretching them to fit curiosity.
Constraints like time windows, sensitive systems, and change freezes can shift what best means, and missing details are often a signal to clarify assumptions rather than to guess.
Evidence expectations and confidentiality discipline prevent you from collecting more than you need, and scope creep pressure should be treated as a reason to confirm authorization, not as an invitation to expand.
Rehearse the checklist: target, method, data, timing, escalation contacts once today so it becomes automatic, because automatic is what you want when a scenario surprises you midstream.
When scope discipline is reflexive, you answer questions like a trusted professional, not like someone chasing technical opportunities without guardrails.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.